Woods was a great movie hero for me, and when I found myself in a rehearsal room with him for the first time, he was so handsome. He was sort of, to me, like the American Ronald Colman.
It's a story to tell on a boat tonight. You'll be standing out under the stars of the shipment. I'm not a girl in a song. I'm not a girl in a story men tell about in boastful voices. I'm Siobhan.
Julie Harris. My only resistance to that was that, much as I admired her, and as prominent as she was at that time because she was the leading young actress of the American theater, I had no reason to believe that she would authentically play as Iris a character as this.
Ladies and gentlemen, your host, Merv Griffin.
In the 1950s, the golden age of television, I was mostly known as a singer. I'd sung with the big band, cut a few albums, and watched the marvelous dramatic shows such as you've been seeing on this series. But on the night of September the 14th, 1955, I became a part of that golden age. James Costigan, a gifted young writer, later known for television plays such as Little Moon of Auburn, Eleanor and Franklin, Love Among the Ruins, had written a play called A Wind from the South. It was to star Julie Harris and Donald Wood, and author James Costigan had an idea.
When we came to the actual casting of A Wind from the South, this wasn't exactly casting because it wasn't a role. It wasn't something to be seen on camera. But I had always dearly loved that song, A Soft Day, from which the line A Wind from the South comes. And I wanted it to be sung beautifully. And because of my admiration for Merv Griffin and that lovely record of the songs from The Quiet Man, I asked for him to do it.
The casting of Julie Harris, which looking at the play today seems inevitable, was not what Costigan intended when he wrote the play.
I wrote what I thought was the perfect part for Siobhan McKenna, and even named it Siobhan. And when the Theatre Guild bought the play for the U.S. Steel Hour, they asked if I had any ideas for that role, and I said only one, Siobhan McKenna. And of course, at that time, the reaction was, well, who is Siobhan McKenna? And they countered with an interesting suggestion, Julie Harris. My only resistance to that was that, much as I admired her, and as prominent as she was at that time because she was the leading young actress of the American theater, I had no reason to believe that she would authentically play as Iris a character as this. Apparently she had some misgivings because this was, I think, toward the end of the summer of 1955. The director, Daniel Petrie, and I were invited to visit Julie Harris at her house in East 50th Street in Manhattan. And we went out and sat in the garden, I remember, and drank iced tea. And the director and I, being young and green, were pretty impressed that we were sitting there with the number one young actress of the American theater, who charmed us with her modesty and her ingenuousness, to the extent that at one point she said she was extremely doubtful about her ability to play this role.
That seems to have been my state of mind as an actress in those days, that I was very apprehensive about my ability.
Donald Wood, at that time a well-known movie actor, almost didn't get into the play because of an overzealous agent.
Mrs. Marshall said, well, we want Donald Wood for the part, and we won't pay him too much. And he said, well, what is not too much? And she said, a small amount, $300 or $400. And Mr. Goodman, my agent, hung up. And I said, wait a minute, why did you do that? And he said, wait a minute. And the phone rang again. Miss Marshall was on the phone and said, why did you hang up? I said, well, Mr. Woods doesn't work for that. So I said, well, what does he work for? He said, $1,500. And Miss Marshall hung up. And, but sure enough, a little later, she called back, and we settled for a figure in between.
He not only enjoyed the role, but true to tradition, he fell in love with his leading lady.
I was very fond of Julie from the moment I saw her, because I'd been an admirer of hers in the theater. And as we progressed during rehearsal, one day, Her husband happened to be on the set quite a bit. And one day, toward the end of rehearsal, I went up to him and I said, I'm in love with your wife. And he said, he's taken aback for a second. He said, fine. I said, what? He said, fine. That's what you should be. And he was right. I fell madly in love with Julie because the part called for me to fall in love with her and because she was such a lovely, lovely person and a good actress. But he didn't object. Then I went home and told my wife I'd fallen in love again. And I explained to her about it, and she said, that's all right, that's your job.
It is always important for actors who are supposed to fall in love with each other, that they like each other. And if they are sort of sympathetic to each other, then it's easy to have a feeling of love for the person.
James Costigan has fond memories of this Theater Guild production. He also has a recollection of a meeting with the top brass of the Theater Guild, which raised a delicate question.
But Teresa Helburn, who was a very old lady at that time, a very feisty little bantam hen of a woman, and with great charm, but a woman who minced no words, she said, well, I do have to raise just one question about this play, and that is about the girl and the hero. Do they, not to put too fine a point on it, do they do it or don't they? I mean, she said it's all very romantic down at the lake shore, but it is nice, and I really want to know if they do it. And very gently, Dan Peasley leaned across to her. Now, Dan Peasley at that time, a very young man, to this venerable lady, and he patted her gently on the hand, and he said, you know, Terry, you mustn't interpret everything in terms of your own experience.
Echoes of a more delicate era. For Costigan, for all, A Wind from the South was a remarkable experience.
Doing A Wind from the South was one of those glorious experiences that tend to make everything afterwards seem anticlimactic.
I really loved Jimmy Costigan and Donald Woods and Dan Petrie, who directed it. It was a very, very happy experience.
As you watch tonight's second performance ever of this live and lovely piece, and incidentally, I have never seen it because my part was done in a little room upstairs over the stage, you might cast a sharp eye on the dance hall scene, for there, dancing in the background as an extra, you can spot a young actor named Roy Scheider. So here now, as seen live on the night of September 14th, 1955, is James Costigan's A Wind from the South.
I think the most exciting, incredible experience of the world that I could imagine, and has been and now, is the absolute suicidal, maniacal pleasure of getting a show on and off, you know, in an hour or 2 hours or whatever you've got live.
You made him backtrack and knuckle under, and you finally beat him to death. You wanted him out, but you wouldn't fire him. That's true. No, it may be a rotten thing to lick a man's boots, but it's a lot worse to be the man whose boots have to be licked.
I'm not a nice human being. What else?
You're not a human being, period. You're a freak. You're an organizational marvel with no compassion for human weakness.
Fielder turned on the intercom and said in his hysterical voice, "This is the greatest show I have ever seen in my life."
Ladies and gentlemen, your host, Keenan Wynn.
1955 was a memorable television year. 1955 saw the debut of Lassie, Phil Silver's You'll Never Get Rich, The $64,000 Question, A Catered Affair by Padashevsky, Your Hit Parade, and Humphrey Bogart, who had originated the role of Duke Mantee, on stage and in film, made his dramatic television debut in The Petrified Forest. It was the year Peter Pan came to television in living color. In fact, one of the shows I did that year, Best of Broadway, was one of the first color series on television, and it was, of course, live. In 1955, I also did a U.S. Steel Hour episode called The Wreck, directed by Alex Siegel and written by that giant of television writers, Mr. Rod Serling. But the most notable dramatic television event of the season was undeniably another brainchild of Mr. Serling's, the Kraft Television Theater presentation of Patton.
I got on the desk one morning a screenplay by Rod Serling, a television play, which which I was delighted to see. It was called Pattern. And I read that, and it was seriously faulted in half its way, and half of it was an absolutely marvelous piece of work, and I kept staying with it to see if we could find a way to make a complete screenplay of it. It was called Pattern, not Patterns.
He said, there's a marvelous, marvelous script that I have. It's a little full. Needs some trimming, needs some theatricality injected into it, but the potential of it is enormous.
Rod really tried his best. I mean, he wrote his heart out trying to create the structure I wanted.
Over the next few months, we talked, and he talked to Rod, and various adjustments were made, sharpening, changing, heightening certain scenes.
So I began to work on the screenplay, and eventually I wrote about the first, little more than the first quarter, up until about the time Ed Begley comes in, which is really mostly pictures. The last scene in the original screenplay, The Pattern, was a boardroom scene where the young man comes in from after the death of Ed Begley, and lashes and lacerates the Everett Stone character, puts him away for good, and then goes back to Cincinnati a hero.
Richard Kiley, who plays the part of the young executive on the way up the corporate ladder, was not Mr. Cook's first choice for the role.
When I first was putting together the character from the original Pattern myself, I was thinking of George Roy Hill, who was, at that time, had been my assistant.
Well, that's interesting. One of his old pals. Yeah.
Dick Carley could not have been better cast, and he was, as I said, and you know, a brilliant actor. And that part really belongs to him.
For those of you who have followed this series, The Golden Age of Television, you know that each of these classic shows recorded on Kinescope had never been seen in their entirety on national television since they were originally broadcast live. Well, tonight's presentation is an exception. After it aired, the show won much critical acclaim, as well as an Emmy for the writer Rod Serling. Jack Gould wrote, a repeat performance at an early date should be mandatory. Well, the network and the sponsor listened. To do a repeat of a live show required the network to reassemble the cast and crew. 1 month after the original telecast, Patterns was seen for a second time, live.
And it was very difficult assembling people because, you know, people were off doing different things.
We immediately got the actors back. It was such a huge success that they wanted to be back on it, too. So fortunately, there were none. The only thing that could really have hurt us was that that Richard Kiley or Elizabeth, or one of the people we could not do without, had been booked. And fortunately, they were all free.
My personal feeling is that the second version of it was a little bit practiced, a little bit slicker than the first. The first had a kind of danger to it, which we all got infected with, and it was very exciting.
The Kinescope you're about to see is a filmed recording of the first live performance from January 12, 1955. Listen to the flowing words. Watch the exciting and fresh direction, and observe the magnificent and graceful performances of actors under the unique pressures of live television. Remember, there was no videotape. There was no starting over if you made a mistake. It was live. Not perfect, but live. And this is the way it happened.